One night in 1943, a Catholic priest named Father Paul Laboute was getting ready for bed in the back room of his church in Paris, France, when he heard the doorbell ring. And Father Paul was quite surprised by this because, number one, it was almost midnight, and number two, World War II was going on. Paris was occupied by the Nazis, and the whole city was under a very strict curfew. So if somebody was here, they're breaking that curfew, but it also meant if somebody was here breaking the curfew to talk to him at midnight, it must be urgent. So he rushed to the door to see who it was. And when he opened up the church door, he saw this frantic-looking middle-aged woman who was standing out on the steps, and she looked totally panicked. She told Father Paul to please come quickly because a young man was dying and he needed someone to say his last rites. Father Paul instinctively poked his head out the door and just looked up and down the road. He was scanning the street outside for soldiers or police. He knew that if he and this woman were spotted out past curfew, they'd be arrested. And so obviously this would be a huge risk to do what she was asking. But to Father Paul, if someone was dying, he had to go. He had to let this person have their last rites. Now, Father Paul knew it would be safest if he and this woman actually traveled separately to where this young man was. So Father Paul, he pulled out a notebook and he told this woman to write down the address. So she did, and then he took the note and he said he'd be over there in a few minutes. And then he rushed inside to grab his coat while she took off running down the road. Not long after that, Father Paul hurried down this pitch black street full of all these old limestone buildings, scanning for the address the woman had written down on this piece of paper. He eventually found the building number and he rushed up and he knocked on the door because he needs to get off the street as fast as possible here, like he's breaking curfew. And the woman, she's not here yet, he doesn't see her outside anyways, there's nobody outside. And so he's knocking on the door and he sees through the window that a light comes on inside. And then he saw these thick curtains inside of this apartment. They parted slightly and someone looked out, and then a moment later, the door opened slightly. And immediately, Father Paul basically pushed himself into the apartment. He doesn't even know who's in here, but he needs to get inside because it's not safe outside. And so Father Paul gets inside and he looks and he sees there's a young man standing there who's just let him in. This is presumably his apartment. And Father Paul doesn't see the woman who had, told him to come here. But also Father Paul's realizing I don't see any sign of somebody dying here. And so it's sort of like this weird, what's going on here? The young man's looking at Father Paul, what is this? And vice versa. And Father Paul, he's like, I was given this address to come give someone their last rites. I was told by a woman that there's somebody dying here. Is there someone dying here? And the young man, he's sort of looking at Father Paul and just sort of looking all around him. And he's like, no, I'm the only one here. I have no idea what you're talking about. And so Father Paul, he's like, well, wait a minute. Is this the right address? Am I at the right address? Because this woman, she was convinced somebody was dying here. Is this the right address? And the young man, he looks at the address and he's like, yeah, no, that's definitely right. You're at the right address. And so Father Paul's like, how weird is that? Are you sure there's nobody here that's dying? And the young man's like, no, really, it's just me. I have no idea what this is about. And so Father Paul, he told this young man, hey, let's just wait a minute because this woman is bound to show up any minute. I mean, she's the one who told me to come here. She's the one who said somebody was dying. When she gets here, we'll let her in and she can explain, what happened. But the two of them, they just sort of awkwardly stood there inside of this apartment looking out the window, waiting for this woman. But quite a bit of time went by and she never showed up. And so eventually the two of them, the father and this young man, they're like, man, that is weird. It's just a mix-up, I guess. What else could it be? He's at the right address. There is a man here, but he's clearly okay. It was a weird thing. And so Father Paul and this young man, they just sort of talked about how weird this was. And the father was about to leave when the young man is like, hey, wait a minute. Since you're here, I haven't spoken to a priest in a long time. And, given what's going on in the world, I'd love to be able to speak to you and confess my sins. Would you be willing to just stay here for a minute and just let me speak to you? And Father Paul's like, of course, I'm here and I've already intruded into your home, of course. And so the two of them, they would sit down inside of the apartment. The woman, she never shows up. These two, complete strangers, basically, just talked for a while. The young man confessed. He got his burdens off his mind and got right with God, in a sense. And eventually, after, his confessional was done, the priest thanked the young man, wished him well, and then he went back outside. And immediately, when the father was outside, it had been pretty quiet to that point, but the second he got out there onto the road, the air raid sirens began going off all through the city. And so at this point, Father Paul had a decision to make. Either run home as he planned to and just take shelter inside of his own home and hope he survived the inevitable bombing run that apparently was coming through any minute now. That's what the sirens were for. Or, given the sirens going off, he knew anytime that happened, if there was a bombing run that followed, dozens and dozens of people were going to get killed. That's how it always went. And they had these things in the city called casualty clearing centers, which were like these intermediary spots before folks got sent to hospitals, which could become overwhelmed really quickly with casualties, where at these clearing centers, officials would basically determine whether or not somebody was salvageable. And Father Paul knew these clearing centers really needed a lot of priests to give last rites and to provide their spiritual services to these people that are, casualties of war. And so for Father Paul, as the sirens are going off, for him, the decision was easy. He turned and he ran right towards that clearing center. And as Father Paul got closer to the clearing center, he was already hearing the sound of bombs impacting buildings and streets not far away from him. Like he's basically running through an air raid. He eventually makes it to this shelter area, this clearing center. He rushes inside, and when he gets in there, he finds that it's actually already really crowded with patients lying on stretchers or huddled on the floor, and nurses were rushing back and forth with bandages and medicine. It was just like this horrifying, chaotic scene. And this is like before a rush of new casualties had even arrived. Like the bombing's happening now. These people are just leftovers, from the last round of attacks. These are people that got passed over, if you will, and were told to stay here and not be sent to the hospital. And so this place is already basically full of dying and mortally wounded people. And very shortly after Father Paul got in there, another rush of freshly injured people from this particular bombing run began being rushed inside. I mean, it was total madness. And so for the next few hours, Father Paul just went all around this clearing center looking for the people who were the most critically injured, who were the least likely to survive the night. And he would pray with them in their final moments. Then, a little before dawn, Father Paul saw one victim who just completely stopped him in his tracks. It was this young man who was obviously deceased, who was lying on the ground with brutal injuries all over his body. And it was the same young man who Father Paul had seen at that random address he had run to, believing he was going to find a dying man, That same young man who was healthy, who was fine, who did his confession to Father Paul, that young man is dead inside of this clearing center, clearly killed by the most recent bombing run. Now, Father Paul had been witnessing war like the rest of the residents of Paris for some time, but he was still just really shaken up by this. He knew very likely, considering this young man lived alone, that he, Father Paul, was the last person to speak to him before he died. And so in some ways, he was very grateful that the young man had asked him to stay back and allow him to confess and get right with God, because it turned out he was about to die. And so Father Paul, he just, without really knowing what else to do, he began reaching into this young man's pockets to, find hopefully a wallet or just any of his valuables, just to make sure he could return these things to this young man's family, so that way he could not only give these things back to them, but also, pay his condolences and tell the family that, he did have a chance to see their son, their brother, before he died. He wanted to do that for the family. And eventually, Father Paul pulled out this man's wallet. And when he opened it, in addition to his ID and a few other things, he found 2 photos. The first was of this middle-aged woman, and on the back of this photo was a single word. It just said mom, but written in French. And at first, Father Paul really didn't think twice about this, but when he flipped the photograph back over and looked at the image again, looked at this woman again, he realized this was the woman who had come to his church to say, you have to go give this dying man his last rites, the woman who never showed up at the address. It's his mother. Like, how could this be? How could she have known he was going to die? Like, what's going on here? And so Father Paul really doesn't know what to even think here. I mean, this is like truly unbelievable. But it only got weirder. He looked at the second photo in this young man's wallet, and this photo as well was of his mother. Except in this photo, his mother was clearly dead. She was laying in a coffin with a crucifix wrapped around her hands that were resting on her chest like she's dead. And this photo, the photo of her dead, was dated on the back, April 8th, 1939, which meant this woman that Father Paul saw at his church that night, who led him to the young man who wound up dying in the bombing run, that woman had died 4 years ago. Father Paul would ultimately contact the family of this young man, and he confirmed that the pictures were definitely his mother and that she really had died 4 years earlier. And also, Father Paul requested a sample of this young man's mother's handwriting to compare the address that he was given by this woman to a known sample of her handwriting. And the handwriting matched exactly. BetterHelp is the paid partner of today's video. Every once in a while, something will remind me of a time when staying connected with people just felt a whole lot more effortless. There was less planning, fewer distractions, and somehow there was just way more time for the people around you. And so when I look back at those times, it's hard not to wish I had sort of appreciated those times more when they were happening. When something feels off in your life, you may find yourself thinking about a simpler time in the past when, relationships felt more natural, when being around people didn't seem to require so much effort. And then you sort of look at your current life and think, boy, it really feels different now. Staying connected in some ways is super automatic with social media and the internet, but it doesn't feel natural. It doesn't feel effortless like it used to. But what you're often missing when you look back at this time isn't just those people. It's really the experience of connection with them feeling so effortless. Therapy can help you make sense of what's changed and may also help you recognize and nurture the connection that's still very much available to you today, even if it doesn't look exactly the way it once did. BetterHelp makes starting therapy easier. Take the quiz and get matched with a credentialed therapist quickly. Switch anytime at no extra cost if it's not the right fit. Click the link in the description or go to betterhelp.com/MrBallin and get 10% off your first month of therapy. On the morning of March 17th, 2019, a young businessman named Feng rolled a suitcase into the lobby of a hotel in Wuzhi County, which is in central China. And he was followed by a young woman named Yomi, who was also carrying some luggage. And as soon as they were in there, they both just sort of did a look around. And they saw the stained carpet and the outdated furniture, and they smelled a funky smell, and they both just sort of looked at each other. And it was obvious as they, exchanged this glance that they both were thinking the same thing. This hotel was a total dump. So Feng and Yomi were coworkers, and they were here on a week-long business trip. Feng had assumed they'd be staying somewhere nice, but clearly the company had other thoughts. They were probably trying to save money by putting them in this budget hotel in a crappy area. But Feng knew, realistically, the two of them couldn't really change this. This is what their company was putting them up in. It is what it is, So he and Yomi just kind of shrugged, and then they both headed over to the front desk to check in. A few moments later, after getting checked in, Feng and Yomi wheeled their suitcases into a tiny elevator. And as soon as they got inside, Feng noticed that Yomi was staring at her room key with a very worried expression. And Feng knew why. So the front desk clerk had given Yomi a room on the 4th floor. And in China, the number 4 is supposed to be very unlucky because the word 4 sounds like the word for death in the Chinese language. Now, Feng was not that superstitious, but he knew Yomi really was. To be given a room on the 4th floor was bad, but it went deeper than that for Yomi. This was a bad start, but Yomi was the type of person who, back home at their work building, she wouldn't even go to the end of hallways, like within their building. She would avoid the end of hallways because she believed that's where spirits would congregate. So she avoided the end of hallways, and she also avoided looking in mirrors or reflective surfaces because she believed that if you did that, your soul could be trapped inside of those alternate universes, inside of these reflective surfaces. And so he just knew this is like a big deal for her, and this was gonna probably totally disrupt this trip. So Feng, he looked at Yomi, and as gently as he could, he told her hey, don't worry about it. Don't freak yourself out. I'm sure it's fine. And Yomi, she nodded like she was agreeing with him, but she just kept staring at the room key like, this is not okay. She's telling him it's gonna be okay, but not to her. This is bad. Eventually, the elevator reached the 3rd floor and the doors opened up, and Feng got off because his room was on the 3rd floor. And he turned to Yomi, who again is still just staring at the room key. And he told her hey, I'm gonna get settled in and then I'll give you a call. Again, everything's gonna be fine, all right? And Yomi, she just nodded, but kept on staring at the room key, and Feng watched as the door shut, and she just continued up to the 4th floor. Less than 10 minutes later, when Feng was in his room, he was still putting his stuff away. He had not even had a chance to call Yomi yet. As he's getting settled in, basically, he sees his cell phone's ringing, and it's Yomi. So he's like, okay, picks it up and he's like, hello. And she's totally frantic. And she says to him that she has to switch her room immediately. She said, not only was her room on the 4th floor, which was bad enough, but the room was at the end of the hallway. And then when she went inside of her room, which took a lot of courage, like she didn't even want to go in the room at all, but when she got in there, she said there were reflective surfaces and mirrors like everywhere. It was like she couldn't avoid looking at herself in these reflective surfaces. And she said on top of that, the air was just weirdly still, like it just felt awful in there. Like she couldn't be in there. This was a perfect storm of all of the things that scare her all in one, and she can't do it. She's got to change rooms. As Feng listened to this, he couldn't help but kind of roll his eyes. This just seemed like a little bit of an overreaction from Yomi. He got it. He understood why she was upset, but it's like, come on. But he wanted this trip to go well, and he did like Yomi. He wanted her to be happy because her mood affected him and this whole trip. And so he just told her, look, stay put, I'll take care of it. Then he left his room, he went down to the front desk, and after speaking to the front desk clerk, they swapped Yomi to a room on the 3rd floor. It was not at the end of the hall, it was in the middle of the hall. Perfect. And so Feng, he grabs this new room key, he goes up to the 4th floor, where he finds Yomi, who's standing in the middle of the hallway. She didn't put anything inside of her room, she's abandoned her room, and she's so relieved to see him. He gives her the new key, she's very thankful. Down to the 3rd floor they go. She heads off to her new room, she thanks him again, and Feng, he goes into his room thinking, okay, problem solved. As soon as she came down to breakfast, Feng immediately noticed that she seemed really, really low energy, like super lethargic or something. She grabbed her food, she sat down next to him, and she wasn't talking, and she was like barely eating her food, and she had this distant look in her eyes, and every time he'd speak to her, she really didn't engage with him. It's like she wasn't even hearing him, just giving him like one-word answers. She just felt totally off. And so Feng, he was definitely worried about Yomi, but also selfishly, he was worried about himself. He's thinking, she seems like she could have picked up maybe like a travel bug, like maybe she's sick or something. And it really stressed him out because he really didn't want to get sick during this work trip. And so he just hoped that whatever was going on with her wasn't contagious. Around lunchtime, Feng and Yomi were joined by 3 other coworkers who had come in on a later flight. And one of them was actually their manager, a guy named Tsai. And so Tsai had the whole group meet up in his room so they could all go over the schedule for the rest of the week. But as soon as the whole group assembled in his room and the meeting began, everybody just wanted to complain about how terrible this hotel was and how silly it was that the company made them stay here. And in fact, one of them said, you know what, I'm just gonna check out and just go to a different hotel. I can't be here. But Tsai shut that idea down right away, saying, you know what, that's way too expensive and way too time consuming, to move at this point. And then he just kind of shifted the whole conversation back to business. And he moved quickly through the entire meeting agenda for the week. And then when they were done, Yomi and the others left to go back to their own rooms. Well, they all left except for Feng. Feng stayed back to use Tsai's bathroom. And so Tsai, he's outside in his room, and Feng, he's in the bathroom. And then when Feng was done, he came back out and he was about to leave when he looked into the room and he saw Tsai. And Tsai was sitting on the end of the bed, staring at the TV. And he had this weird look on his face, like a very troubled expression. And so Feng, he walks over to Tsai and he says, hey, are you okay? And Tsai wouldn't tell him. Clearly something was wrong, but he wouldn't tell him. But eventually he would tell Feng, I've changed my mind about this hotel. We need to leave this hotel immediately. A few hours later, the whole group checked out of the crappy hotel and moved their whole operation to a newer hotel downtown. And on their way to their new rooms, Feng, who was in great spirits about this change, made a comment to Yomi about how much better this place was. But Yomi just kind of ignored him and still acted like she could be sick or something and just wandered off to her own room, then shut the door behind her. The next morning, everyone met up for breakfast again, except for Yomi. She didn't show up. And so eventually Feng called up to her room, and when she picked up, she sounded really groggy. And then she said she definitely had a fever, like she was sick. And when Feng heard that, he's like, man, I sat next to her on the plane. I've eaten with her at every meal. I've been near her this whole time. If she's sick, I'm probably next. But he also felt totally normal right now, so he just hoped that whatever Yomi had, 1, it wasn't too serious for her sake, but 2, it wasn't that contagious. And over the next few days, Feng didn't get sick. So for him, he was thinking, great, I've been spared. But Yomi's situation, her fever, it only got worse. And she also started acting just really strange. She would lock herself inside of her room for hours at a time, refusing to eat or talk to anyone, which was obviously really bizarre on a business trip where the expectation is you're going to do a lot of eating and talking to people. And then on the rare occasions where she would come out of her room, Feng noticed that her eyes seemed like lifeless, like her mind was just somewhere else entirely. It was like she had this constant 1,000-yard stare going on. By Thursday, so 5 days into this trip, everybody was really worried about Yomi. Feng actually took her to see a doctor, and the doctor couldn't tell what was causing her fever, but he gave her antibiotics and then told her what she really needed was to leave this business trip and just go home and rest. And when their manager, Tsai, heard this recommendation from the doctor, he actually offered to buy Yomi a ticket to fly back home. But to all of their surprise, Yomi refused to leave. She just went back to her hotel room and locked the door behind her. 3 days later, on the evening of Sunday, March 24th, Feng stood in the hallway outside of Yomi's room as Tsai knocked on her door and shouted for Yomi to come out. The work trip was now over, and all 5 of them needed to leave for the airport to go back home, but Yomi was refusing to leave. She was not coming out. But finally, Feng and Tsai heard the sound of feet shuffling to the door inside of the hotel room. And even though Yomi didn't open the door, she called out to them in a very weak voice that they should just leave. Take your flight, go home. I'll catch my own flight in the morning. Feng was about to argue with her when Tsai raised his wrist and showed him his watch, and Feng realized that if they were going to catch their own flight, they had to leave right now. And so Tsai called back through the door that he'd book Yomi her own ride to the airport if she just sent him her new flight information. But for right now, they really had to go. Best of luck, but we gotta go. And so Feng, even though he felt pretty conflicted about what to do here, he ultimately decided that, they'd done everything they could, and he just followed his manager down to the car. And as they got in the car, Feng thought to himself, it's like Yomi, she's an adult. And if she thinks she's too sick to travel and she wants to fly home on her own the next day, that's her decision. But Yomi didn't find her own way home because 2 days later, she was dead. That day, March 26th, Feng got a call from work with the news. The hotel staff had apparently found Yomi's body inside of a room when they went inside of there to clean it, but the exact condition of her body and cause of death were still unknown. When Feng heard this, he was devastated. He'd known that Yomi clearly was sick, but he'd never thought she was close to dying. And so now he was just overcome with grief at the loss of his friend, but also some level of guilt that maybe he could have done more to help her, and just confusion around this whole thing. Like what happened? Feng's best guess is that she must have caught some bug, and she very likely caught it on the first day when they were at that totally gross, unsanitary hotel. But Feng also knew that he very likely would never get a real answer. And so ultimately, Feng just tried to move on. He kind of tried to bury his thoughts around the business trip because it was just so raw and he just didn't have any answers. And so he just thought it was best to push it over here and just go on with life. And that strategy pretty much worked until 2 years later, in November of 2021. That month, Feng met up with his manager, Tsai, who was on that fateful trip, for drinks. So immediately after that business trip, the whole group had been so traumatized that they really didn't discuss what happened much. They talked about the fact that obviously Yomi had died, but nobody got into details. It was too raw. But now that some time had passed, Tsai and Feng, they spent the whole time over drinks talking about Yomi and the trip. And Feng, he asked Tsai if he agreed that Yomi must have just caught her illness that killed her while staying at that first hotel. Do you think that's what it was? Just an unsanitary place, she got sick, she died. Do you think that's what happened? But to Feng's surprise, Tsai just shook his head and said, no, I don't think that's what happened. Then he asked Feng if he remembered that moment in the first hotel when Feng had come out of the bathroom and found Tsai sitting in front of the TV, acting sort of funny. And Feng's like, yeah, I asked you what was wrong and you wouldn't tell me. And then you said we need to switch hotels. I do remember that. I thought that was weird. And so Feng was confused by what his manager was asking him. Like, why are you asking about that moment? And he stared at Tsai, and Tsai looked back at him for a really long moment, just stared right at Feng. And then eventually he told Feng that he had it all backwards about Yomi. He said Yomi didn't catch something from that first hotel. The hotel caught Yomi. Tsai explained to Feng that while he was still in the bathroom, inside of the same room, Tsai said he turned on the TV. He was just watching TV for a moment. And then he saw something on the TV that was impossible. And it immediately indicated to him that something was terribly wrong with this hotel. He told Feng that he turned the TV on, and what he saw inside of the screen was Yomi. It was her face. It was like she was trapped inside of the reflective surface of the TV. And she had this look of absolute terror on her face. And she was looking out at Tsai like, you have to help me. I'm stuck. I'm trapped inside of here. And Tsai, he said he was so frightened that his first instinct was, I have to switch hotels. I need to save Yomi. But he said, Feng, when you came out and you asked me what was wrong, I didn't even know how to explain what was happening. I just knew that Yomi's life was at stake here. And so Tsai said to Feng that, we switched hotels, but it was already too late. Yomi's spirit was trapped inside of that first hotel. It had her spirit. And so her body went to the new hotel, but not with her spirit. And that's what killed her. Feng would eventually post this long account of this business trip on Chinese social media. And right away, lots of people read it and were really intrigued by it. And so internet sleuths who were taken with the story would actually locate court records from a lawsuit that was related to Yomi's death. But the lawsuit didn't really talk about, all the weird stuff that Feng detailed in his account. Really, it was just sort of matter of fact. And in fact, really all it said about her death was that it was classified as sudden death caused by various complications. So there really was not a whole lot more of meat on this story inside of the lawsuit. However, not long after Feng's story basically went viral on Chinese social media, like right as people were really trying to dig into this and see, what really happened to Yomi? Like, this is so weird. Was it, spirits? Was it the hotel? Like, what did it? What killed her? Around that same time, the Chinese government removed his post under Chinese content policies for spreading paranoia and fear. And so all that's left now from the story, at least from Feng's version of the story, are a few screenshots from people who read his account at the time and wanted to preserve it. One afternoon in the spring of 1948, a 12-year-old girl named Maggie sat by an open window in her kitchen at her home in a suburb of Charlotte, North Carolina. Maggie was trying to do her homework, but she couldn't focus because the entire neighborhood was way too quiet. Now, normally at this time of day, which is when Maggie typically did her homework, her neighbor would play his violin in his den, and the music always helped Maggie study. But for the past few weeks, her neighbor's house had been completely silent. And the reason for that was pretty tragic. So Maggie's neighbor was 19-year-old Kenneth Null, and he was like this unbelievably talented musician. As a young child, he had been like this violin prodigy. And now as a 19-year-old, he was like on another level with how good he was at playing that instrument. And so it was basically common knowledge that someday, probably soon, he was going to be famous. However, just a few weeks ago, Kenneth had been in a terrible car accident, and his right arm was completely mangled. Doctors said he would never use it again, which meant his violin career was over. Maggie knew that Kenneth was just completely devastated. His whole life had been built on playing the violin. It's like, what's he going to do now? And furthermore, Maggie herself had barely seen him leave the house since he got home from the hospital. It was like he was a shut-in. It was like his life was wrecked. And so for Maggie, as she sat there by the window, listening to the silence, she just couldn't take it anymore. She just really wanted to help Kenneth, even if it was something small, because he really had helped her a great deal over the many times she'd done her homework listening to his music. She wanted to return the favor. So she got up from the table and she walked over to the cupboard and she found a candy bar on the top shelf. And she decided she would go next door, she would give this to Kenneth, and it would cheer him up. A few minutes later, Maggie was standing on Kenneth's front porch and she had her candy bar hidden behind her back, and with her other hand, she was knocking on the door. And a moment later, the door opened and it was Kenneth. And immediately, Maggie could tell that, even though she knew Kenneth was probably not doing well, he looked awful. Like he was in really bad shape. His damaged arm, was in a sling across his chest. His hair was greasy and there were bags under his eyes like he hadn't been sleeping. To Maggie, it just seemed like Kenneth was extremely depressed, extremely sad. So she did the thing she came over here to do. She pulled the candy bar out from behind her back and she handed it to him. And she just said, "I hope you feel better." And Kenneth, despite looking so pained, he smiled and he looked genuinely touched by this gesture. And he actually reached out and he hugged Maggie with his good arm and he thanked her for coming over to see him. And then Maggie, maybe against her better judgment, she told Kenneth that she really missed him playing the violin after school each day. She said that his music was so beautiful. And to Maggie's surprise, Kenneth told her not to worry about it. He promised her that he would play the violin again, because if he didn't, he wouldn't want to live. One night, a few weeks later, around midnight, Maggie woke up in bed to the sound of violin music, and she gasped because immediately she recognized the melody and she knew that Kenneth was playing his violin again. And Maggie was so excited that even though it was the middle of the night, she climbed out of bed, she ran down the hallway, and went out her front door. A minute later, Maggie was once again standing on Kenneth's front porch. And she knew that Kenneth and his mom often left the front door unlocked. And so Maggie, who's just so excited, she just reaches down and she tries the handle and it's unlocked. And so she opens the door up, she steps inside. And, she had been listening to Kenneth's music this whole time, but it was sort of muffled because it's inside the house. Now she's in the entryway of the home and she can hear it. It's so much louder and it's so beautiful. And for a moment, she just stood there, listening to what in her mind was like the most beautiful music she had ever heard in her life. And so she stood there just listening to the music. And eventually she decides to just go into the den to go find Kenneth and actually listen to him play, like right in front of her. She wanted to see it. She wanted to experience it again. And she wanted to congratulate him. And so into the den she goes. The moment she steps through the threshold and she's in the den, the music stops and the room is completely quiet. The house is eerily quiet. And she looks around like, did he see me? Is he nervous now that I'm here? She looks around and at first she doesn't even see him. Like he's not in the den. It's dark in the den. But then she looks at the couch and she screams. On the couch was Kenneth, and he was very clearly dead. His body was stiff, and in his hands he was clutching his violin. A doctor would later determine that Kenneth had died of a cerebral hemorrhage a full 2 hours before Maggie first heard that music.